Hi, this is Carl, and this is part 2 of the discussion about understanding Michel Thomas. Now, what I'll do first of all is I'll just give a brief overview of what I discussed in part 1 of this series, and then I'll move the discussion forward. And I started out part 1 by mentioning the fact that Michel Thomas was born in Poland in February of 1914, that he served in the French resistance during the Second World War, and then later moved to the United States, where in 1947 he founded his first institute for modern foreign language learning, known as the Polyglot Institute, although many people around that time were unfamiliar with the definition of the word polyglot, and therefore Michel Thomas later decided that he would change the name to something more comprehensible, although I can't quite remember what that name was. I then took 1947 as a reference point and made an allusion to the fact that Michel Thomas by then would have already been able to have put together a linguistic structure and a course from which he was able to teach the syntax and the makeup of those modern foreign languages in which he had acquired linguistic acquisition for the purpose of teaching them to members of the general public, and of course a number of famous celebrities as well, such as, for example, Eddie Izzard, Emma Thompson, and the late Princess Grace of Monaco. I then drew a contrast between the advanced status of Michel Thomas as a language teacher in the 1940s to the majority of teachers, especially in mainstream education, who, if we were to ask members of our third generation, such as our grandparents, they would say that if they were to think back to the days of their language education in school, they would have found, for example, let's say, French tuition, education in French to have been very tedious, very boring, maybe repetitive, very proactive as far as the teacher was concerned, and that it would have probably been more often than not a case of the teacher standing up in front of the class, maybe drawing out a verb table on the blackboard, putting into the verb table the separate verb conjugations, asking the class to recite these, expecting the pupils in the class to be able to remember these in time for a future session, maybe transcribing a dictation by the teacher, and then in a subsequent question a member of the class would have been picked on by the teacher to maybe stand up in front of his or her classmates to recite the information or the class content from a previous session, and then if he or she were unable to do that sufficiently or adequately enough, then he or she may have been forced to endure some kind of punishment or embarrassment from the teacher before the other members of the class. I then started to speak briefly about the 2 ground rules which Michel Thomas introduces at the beginning of his CD courses, which have since been republished by the company Hodder and Stoughton. One of those ground rules is that anyone who is listening to the content of the language courses has to be relaxed, that there must be no guessing games involved, since things like this, guessing words, implies that people aren't always absolutely sure that they've remembered the translation of a word, or that they've remembered the translation of a set phrase and the individual words which make up that set phrase, and that if we are unable to relax from the outset and we overwhelm ourselves with misconceptions about language learning, such as, for example, well, all non-native speakers of English, or nearly all non-native speakers of English, can speak English much better than native speakers of English could ever hope to speak a modern foreign language. This injects into many of us feelings of despondency from the outset, and therefore we need to erase these feelings from the beginning as soon as possible. But not only that, if we aren't relaxed, then we will obviously tend to clam up. We will be thinking along the lines of there is too much to learn, that if we try to string a sentence together verbally, then we will be more than likely to stumble upon nearly every word. We will have to think about the grammar. We will have to become conscious at all times as to whether the words are coming in the correct order, whether we have said them correctly. We'll also maybe doubt that our pronunciation isn't necessarily up to standard, that we need to work on that. All different types of misconceptions and doubts and negativity being embedded and injected into the language learning process before we've even started out as, in some cases, ab initio learners. Now, what I think it's important to bear in mind as well is that amongst those ground rules which are prescribed by Michel Thomas, he actually does mention at the same time that language learning isn't to be looked upon as a homework task or as something which needs to be memorized or written down. There is no note-taking, as we hear from the instructions given on the CD courses. And it's quite interesting that he does mention that it's not to be considered as a homework task or as a memory game, because this doesn't imitate what I would call the most naturalised form or naturalised forms of linguistic acquisition. In other words, we have to give some consideration as to how we learn our mother tongue. We're born, we leave our mother's wombs, and then within the first 0 to 18 months of our lives, we're already speaking words and short phrases, maybe 1 or 2 sentences. And this is due to the fact that we learn to speak and we become accustomed to listening to the spoken language before we actually learn to read it and learn to write it. So therefore, Michel Thomas is aware that the spoken language has to be used as the initial point of departure where language learning is concerned, because that way it imitates the way in which we learn our mother tongue whilst we're growing up, in this case as citizens of the United Kingdom. Now, it's also important to bear in mind that there are essentially 2 different ways in which we can learn a modern foreign language. Maybe more, but 2 essentially different ways. One of those ways is to actually become immersed in the culture of the country in which the modern foreign language in question is spoken, engaging with native speakers without necessarily actually attending classes or having private tuition during the time that we spend abroad, if that is for a lengthy period of time. And then on the other hand, we have people, and this would apply to a majority of people, well, especially in my area of the UK, people who wish to become linguistically proficient and enjoy learning and acquiring vocabulary and spoken skills in a new modern foreign language by attending a class or becoming involved in a private tuition setting, but not necessarily people who have either lived in a modern foreign language, in a country where a modern foreign language is spoken for a lengthy period of time, or the people who don't actually ever plan to do that. So people who want to gain confidence with the spoken language, and arguably that is the learner need of a majority of individuals. They attend classes, they decide to learn a new modern foreign language with the intention of becoming confident with the spoken language more than anything else, also being able to understand what is said to them by native speakers, whereas reading and writing skills are actually less of a priority where a majority of people are concerned. So on the one hand, we have people, just to recapitulate that, people who go to a country where the modern foreign language is spoken as the mother tongue, and on the other hand, people who learn a modern foreign language without living there and instead decide to attend classes. Now, as far as the Michel Thomas courses are concerned, I think it's very important to bear in mind that although Michel Thomas did teach a number of school children throughout his 58 to 60-year career, I think it was, I think the main intention, the main purpose of having released these CD courses is to give the adult language learning population the confidence that they, despite any age-related concerns, are arguably able to pick up a modern foreign language on the precondition that the appropriate methods are being used. In other words, that there is an initial point of departure, the spoken language, and that into that priority we can embed and inject on a secondary plane the grammatical components which are essential for someone who doesn't pick up the spoken language as naturally as someone who is living in the country where that language is spoken as the mother tongue. We need to embed the grammatical component, but we must not use grammatical terminology and complicated grammatical terms as the points of departure where language learning is concerned. I will continue this discussion in part 3, and hopefully so far it has been a fruitful conclusion to at least what some of the Michel Thomas methodology does stand for. But as I say, hopefully after I concluded the third and final part of this discussion, we will be able to gather some more thoughts as to just what Michel Thomas does represent as far as language learning is concerned, and how he is able to encourage us to do that with confidence and achieve our goal of learning a modern foreign language effectively.